All right, good morning, everybody. My name's Alex Vines, and I'm head of the Africa program here at Chatham House. Today, we're going to be talking about redefining partnership, the EU-Africa relationship beyond the Cotonou Partnership Agreement. And I'm delighted this Monday morning to be welcoming to Chatham House Koen Vivak, who's the Managing Director for Africa of the European External Action Service. A couple of house issues. One is that we're live streaming today. We had lots of requests for this particular meeting to be live streamed from across sub-Saharan Africa and beyond. And so that's what we're doing. And for that very reason, this is a meeting that's fully on the record because it's fully transparent in every way possible.
No Chatham House
so no Chatham House rule or anything like that. The EU-Africa relationship is something that we at Chatham House work a great deal on. It is a priority for us. We have our own project on Central Europe and Africa, which we were describing to Koen slightly earlier. And one of my colleagues in the corner, Tigis Diamari, was actually in some of the prep meetings in Abidjan in the run-up to the AU-EU summit. And another of my colleagues, Paul Melly, was actually in Brussels at the European Parliament for discussions. So we're very engaged, not just around summits, actually, Koen. We try and get engaged continuously throughout the processes. And I myself am writing something at the moment on the future of the joint Africa-EU strategy. So thank you for coming. There's a lot happening, and particularly the renegotiations of what might happen with the Cotonou Agreement, but also it'd be good to hear what are the results of the AU-EU summit and how is the partnership developing forward. So Koen, welcome to Chatham House. Really lovely to see you. I will see you in Brussels, but it's nice to see you in London. And you brought good weather with you too, which is a double bonus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everybody. I'm really happy, pleased, but also honored to be here. And it is a very good moment. I think it's a very good moment to look at our relationship, to do it here in London, with the current evolutions here. We care about a European approach towards Africa, and the UK has been a very important partner in that, and we hope that we can continue working together. But it's also a very strategic moment for the relations between the European Union and Africa because of Cotonou. In 2020, our current agreement treaty will come to an end, will expire, and we have to discuss, negotiate with our African partners, but also more globally with the ACP, the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries, what kind of relationship we want to build for the future. So this is a hugely strategic opportunity, and we better have it right. I will focus obviously on EU-Africa relationship, which is not only my responsibility, but we also believe is the most important dimension of the whole post-Cotonou discussion because of the proximity of our relationship. Before we can look at what we want to do in the future, I think it is important to explain and to set out how we look at Africa, we as Europeans, but also I think what has changed in Europe when we consider our place in the global world and towards Africa. Very briefly, what we see as change on the African continent. Mo Ibrahim uses the term of tipping point. Africa is at the tipping point, and I think it captures well what we think is happening. In all its diversity, it's going to profound economic, societal, and political changes, and this is something we cannot underestimate. The increasing number of African governments are taking a leading role in tackling the challenges of the continent at national level, but also at regional level. We see democracy and institutions growing and strengthening. We see that in particular in Western Africa. Look at the Gambia model. Look at the way the region is tackling challenges or trying to forge a new national consensus in Togo. The way today they contribute in ensuring good elections in Sierra Leone. So there's a very good dynamic. We don't see the same dynamic, I have to say, in Central Africa. Also in East Africa is under challenge. On the other hand, we have important transitions ongoing in Angola, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, which bode well for the future. Again, when you look at Mo Ibrahim, he sees overall improvement in the last 10 years, but he also sees a slowdown in the last 5 years, and in particular in the area of safety and rule of law, where there is a decline. So there's a mixed picture in this area, which I think we should relate also to security. That's the way we look at it. Security, because that's an important feature also for the relationship with the European Union. Radicalization, extremism, the belt from West Africa to the Horn is something we observe with concern, also in particular because of the increased interferences from the outside, which play out mostly in this area. In contrast, we see an Africa that is much more confident on the international scene, at the continent level, but also a global level. The reform of the African Union is something we welcome very much. It's an ambitious agenda, but it's an agenda we think we should fully support. Less than 2 weeks ago, the Continental Free Trade Agreement in Kigali, Agreement on Free Movement of Peoples. These are fantastic examples of progress and ambition of the continent, which is extremely positive. The continent that is coming much more together because they know if they not come up with one voice on climate change, on SDGs, they will not be heard. Politics, but also the economics, extremely important. It's of course always difficult to draw universalized conclusions, even at sub-Saharan level, because of the diversity of the economic, the different features, because also of the dominance of South Africa and Nigeria in macroeconomic aggregates. But despite disparities between economies that depend on commodity exports and those that don't, there are some common developments. First of all, and that's really the way we look at the continent, is the undeniable sources of opportunity and potential. That's the way Africa is, let's say, projected now in Europe. Natural resources, young workforce, growing middle class, business opportunities in underdeveloped and the new innovative sectors is the key feature. This should not hide imbalances, for instance, on public debt levels, which have increased and which we look with some concern. Domestic revenue mobilization is still lagging behind. There's need for public finance management, lack of region integration, despite the ambition of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's still more costly to do business in Africa than to export towards the outside Africa, and that is of course not tenable. And that is also linked to the improved business climate we need to see. All these encouraging trends are often fragile, and they are not giving the better prospects for the larger part of the population we want to see. 3 issues there. The demographic dividend, which is often projected, can only be cashed unless the continent triggers the necessary demographic transition. That's clear. I will not repeat the figures, you know them, of Africa's growing population, but it's really transforming the continent. Secondly, Africa will have to provide much more for its own security, rather than relying on international support. There's a logic, 60 years after independence, but also the recognition that we cannot leave them alone on this. I will come back to that. And then thirdly, on the economics, despite growth, despite its performance, growth rates have not generated sufficient jobs and have not been inclusive enough to significantly curb poverty. So that are elements that should determine the way we partner now with the continent. And let me end just on this, let's say, presentation on Africa. Quote Vera Songwe, who is the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. She says, Africa's demographic dividend could well turn into a demographic trap with more countries falling behind and making the SDGs unattainable by 2030. So Africa needs new growth models to help guide public policy. And in our view, that should include diversification, manufacturing, inclusive growth. Inclusiveness is very important, but also developing human capital. So that for Africa. European Union. 2 years ago, the European Union developed a global strategy for its security and external action. And it's a global strategy which has a different feature than the previous one in the early 2000s. It clearly says that our security and our prosperity will have to be gained within Europe, but also externally in the global world. And nothing is guaranteed in the current circumstances. So we need a much more proactive foreign policy, external action, also to preserve security and prosperity in the continent. And this notion of interdependence has never been so clear, in particular with Africa. Africa is considered part of our neighborhood, and that goes certainly for the Sahel and for the Horn, but it also stretches within deeper in the African continent. The migration surge has influenced a lot this vision, and this is a vision that is shared by 28 member states. Security, migration, interdependence, attacks in Europe, but we know most of the attacks are happening on the African continent, and that the fight against terrorism is a global fight that no one single-handedly can win. So we have to work together, and it leads to a different kind of relationship, a relationship which is much more based on shared interests, which we think is a very sound basis for work. One additional dimension in the way we look at Africa is global order. We, as Europe, we think that global order is under stress these days, and I think we can all witness this. And it is therefore very much important that Europe and Africa can continue working together. One of the most successful things we have done together is partnering on climate change. The Paris Agreement would not have been possible without Europe and Africa working together, and we did so as well on the SDGs. What does it mean, all this, the way we look at Africa, things that are changing on the European side? What does it mean now for policy? First, we need to promote economic investment. We have come to the conclusion that it's not development cooperation that will create the jobs the continent urgently and very importantly needs. It's the private sector. So there will be much more work, and we have done this already in the past couple of years, much more work to include the private sector in our work and our partnership with Africa. At the Abidjan Summit, we have proposed the external investment plan. It's 4 billion euros, which could leverage up to 40 billion. It's part a blending instrument to decrease the cost of lending, but it's also partly a guarantee fund, which should diminish the risk for investment on the African continent. It's an important tool. It's just one of a new approach towards supporting much more private sector investment on the continent. We need to fit this into our trade policy, economic partnership agreements, being and shaping them in a way that they become a real building block for the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which now has received a new boost in Kigali. It means that we have to develop a better mix on how we can improve economic governance, the business climate, macro policy in the different African countries. You've certainly heard about the G20 compacts. The European economic diplomacy is also working in that direction. Our budget support to many countries can contribute to it. We are putting in place business clubs, European business clubs in many countries, to work together with local governance in improving the business climate. We also have to invest in human capital. Vocational training, education, in particular investing in girls and women, were important features at the Abidjan summit, and we are following up on this. Also, finally, discussing with the governments individually how we can support specific value chains, where there are quick wins possible in terms of job creation, in terms of export, and creating economic prosperity. Agribusiness, digital agenda is an important there. That for the economics. Migration. Migration, as I said, is an important element of our relationship. We don't want migration to determine the partnership between the European Union and Africa, but it is one which is of interest for European public. It's an element that determines the outcome of elections in Europe, so we better take care of it. And we have done so. The external dimension of the migration policy, we think, has been extremely positive. We started, as you know, 2 years ago in La Valletta, defining a broad agenda on migration. This is not just stopping migration at the borders, it is developing, partnering with Africa on migration, focusing in particular on the root causes. How can you contribute to economic, let's say, prosperity and opportunity for the populations in Africa, working together in fighting trafficking, let's say, and smuggling, but also discussing return readmission, also discussing legal migration and increasing opportunities for Africans to come in to Europe. All that has been laid out at regional level. I will not go into details here with the Rabat process for West Africa, Khartoum for the Horn of Africa, and the mobilization of additional resources. Trust fund to be able to respond flexibly of 3 billion euros to date, investing in economic opportunities, but also investing in security and investing and helping, assisting African countries to continue sharing the burden of refugee populations. Africa hosts 30% of the world's refugee populations, and very generously, and that's very important as well. In Abidjan, migration, of course, was discussed. You all know it. It was at the moment that there was the crisis in Libya and the dramatic situation of African migrants there. And one of the main outcomes, practical outcomes of the Abidjan summit was a very, let's say, spectacularly positive cooperation between Europe, Africa, and the UN in order to save stranded migrants in Liberia and to operate voluntary returns to their countries of origin. And to date, thanks to the European Union, but also with the help of the African countries, we repatriated already more than 15,000 migrants back and voluntary to their country. This needs to be continued, and I think we want to expand this also at continental level. A third area is governance, what we call now resilience in the global strategy. Of course, is a very important element. It will always be a key feature of Europe's policy. Governance in the broadest terms remains a key objective for our external action. And the global strategy balances interests and values with the notion of principled pragmatism. It's, of course, one thing to put that in a strategic document. Another thing is to translate that in our daily work in a partnership. And I think that will be one of the key elements also when we look at new terms of a relationship under the post-Cotonou. But we think that on the one hand, there is a limit of conditionality-based relationship. On the other hand, having a relationship which has expanded as it is now with other broader relationships with economic, security dimension, energy dimension, migration dimension, could be a framework where the terms of reference for an honest discussion on governance far away from the perceived patronizing approach of the past could occur. Peace and security, a major element for the continent, for us and for the partnership. There we definitely need to adapt to the new threats the continent and we are facing as Europe, multiplicity of actors, terrorism. The focus is less on countries but much more on a regional approach and regional answers to security threats. Influence from the outside. When we look at the Horn of Africa these days, European Union, we very much link it to the Gulf countries, the Red Sea dimension influence, and of course when you talk and work on the Sahel, you cannot do it without discussing and see what can be done on the situation in Libya. How to respond to this? The European Union has been and will continue to be, that's our ambition, the main partner of the African continent on peace and security. First and foremost by putting the financial means at the disposal of Africa to deal with its security challenges. We have the Africa Peace Facility, you know, since 2004, 2.5 billion euros has been invested in security. It has been a security tool, but a very much political tool because it allowed African Union to grow and to, let's say, implement its policies. We will want to continue this, but it's not enough, that's clear. And thanks to the migration and the security challenges, we have moved much more in the security, in the development security nexus. We cannot separate these things. I refer to the trust fund we have put in place. Our budget support is moving much more in security, in capacitating country level as well to deploy in ungoverned areas, to manage borders and so on. We also, when we look at the future, we have to rethink the peacekeeping in Africa. Africa is putting in place its peace fund to be able to support financially its efforts. Kaberuka plan, which is very important, but the doctrine needs to change as well. When the Brahimi report after the genocide in Rwanda said that no peacekeeping where there's no peace to keep, it's of course, in the current circumstances, not a doctrine which cannot hold anymore. When the UN cannot do it, Africa is ready to do it. We see it in Somalia, we see it in the Sahel, G5 countries. We have to find ways to ensure predictable funding for their efforts, and Europe is ready to contribute to it. It all refers for us to stronger cooperation between the European Union, the African Union, which is the lead organization on peace and security on the continent, and the United Nations in a more strategically context. Let me conclude on post-Cotonou. So I said it is a strategic opportunity. It's an opportunity to innovate, but also to consolidate. We already have a fantastic relationship, a very broad and deep one. We need to adapt it. We need both in substance and in mechanisms. What does that mean? First, a shift from ACP to the continent to continent. ACP, we want to continue that dimension. It is an important one, in particular on the global governance, but we definitely want to give much more focus to the continent-to-continent relationship. Europe, Africa. Because that's a proximity, that's where direct interests are present. That means that we will consider Africa much more as one continent. African Union is an important or a key element there, but of course it's not the only one. We will also have to see how this plays out with the regional economic communities, and in particular we have to see how it plays out with the Northern African countries and South Africa, which are not part of the ACP process. But we are convinced that if the political vision is there, and if Africa is ready to play it as one with us, as a continent, we can find all the necessary solutions for the specific partnerships we are having with Northern Africa and South Africa. Secondly, we need to change the approach to a certain extent. Abidjan Summit was really about African ownership, African taking its leadership for its future and the future of the continent. So we need an approach which reflects this much more than what we had in the past. It should become a much more reciprocal relationship based on Africa's agenda. Thirdly, the building blocks needs to be more diversified, moving away from, further away from pure development partnership towards an economic private sector partnership, finding the right ways to work on governance, redefining our approach in this area in a way that conciliates a realistic assessment of a strategic and changing strategic environment and relationship with our commitment as Europe and a shared commitment with Africa to advance core values. And on peace and security, we need a much more, as I said, strategic approach with our partners and ensure that we have the tools also to move in the development security nexus and look at African peacekeeping, let's say, mandate and resources. Finally, tools, instruments. We can have a policy, but we'd also need the tools. And you know that in 2020, there will not only be a new agreement, but also a new financial cycle for the European Union. And within that, which we call the multi-annual financial framework, we need the tools and external action funding that matches our ambition. Commitment to the SDGs, the security and migration. We cannot work in silos, so we want to move towards one big instrument that gives us sufficient flexibility, like we have done for the trust funds, to ensure that we have the means to do it. There's talk about a European Peace Fund that would not only include the Africa Peace Facility, but also other means that would help us to invest in security and stability on the African continent. So the stakes are high, both policy-wise, but also internally for us to ensure that the European Union has the instruments to deliver on the ambition. But we see, and that's very promising, on the African side, that discussions are gearing up, that they are consolidating an African position on its relationship with Africa. We have done so at the European side. You know, we have tabled our proposal for post-Cotonou, and we see now a lot of activity and discussions on the African side. And this summer, we should start these negotiations, which then should lead to a conclusion in 2020. Strategic, but we look at it very, very positively and with very much ambition. Thank you very much.
Koen, thank you very much indeed for a very comprehensive and very eloquent presentation. We have 30 minutes to interrogate what Koen's told us. So just a reminder that this is fully on the record if you came in late. And not only is it on the record, but it is being live streamed globally. And if you are live streaming us and you have a question for Koen, you can tweet it using the hashtag CHAfrica. Thank you. Who would like to ask Koen a question? It is early in the morning, but let's go here first of all. There is a microphone coming to you, sir. Do tell us who you are.
Thank you, Alex. Ivo Gabar from Gabar Strategies. Mr. Verwake, you were referring to the root causes of migration, and I would like to ask you a question about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a very major crisis is currently brewing. Since President Joseph Kabila declined to step down in 2016, when his second mandate came to an end, the country has been subject to violence, significant violence. Only in 2017, we've seen 4 million displaced people in the country. So I was wondering, what is Brussels doing to prevent the crisis from precipitating further, not least because this could trigger a major wave of further migration towards Europe? Thank you.
Anybody else got a migration question? So we can cluster them together. Otherwise, we just focus on this one. Okay, let's go ahead.
Oh yes, I was looking for the micro, but
oh no, it's there on you.
When we look at the DRC, we don't look immediately towards from a migration perspective, but it's all interlinked. And when I explained that for the global strategy of the European Union, of course, we look at neighborhood in Sahel and the Horn of Africa, but it stretches also into the in Central Africa because of the interlinkages. And if the DRC is of a continental dimension, so it is of continental interest, but also beyond that for the European Union. The DRC and the solution for the Democratic Republic of Congo lies in the elections. We have a date now. We strongly believe that it is important that elections are held at the moment which I announced now. And we see increasingly, and that's very positively, also Africa coming together around that objective. African Union, with whom we are in constant contact, but also the regional and the region, SADC, Angola, South Africa, all stress the importance of the elections. And a peaceful transition of power. For that, of course, we need to look at the quality of the elections. There's the political environment, which will be very important to ensure that there is an inclusive process with the political space so that everyone can participate and contribute to the elections. And then there's also, let's say, the more technical dimension of the elections, the quality that these elections are credible and cannot be contested. We are working very closely as an EU together with the UN, but also with African partners to ensure this. We are part, EU, of a group of electoral experts that has been referenced in UN Security Council resolutions, and we now have, let's say, terms of reference for interaction with the Congolese government. And that group will not only assist the government and the Electoral Commission, but will also, let's say, contribute to ensuring the credibility of the process and reassuring the international community that it can invest in these elections. The European Union has offered a first financial contribution. We are ready to do more if need and if the conditions are in place. But this is now really, let's say, the moment where the progress is needed. And before summer, there will be important rendezvous because of the call of the electorate, but also the call of candidates, where further clarity will be given on these elections. It's a key issue, as I said, for the continent. It's a key issue for us, but an area where the partnership and the governance partnership I talked about between Europe and Africa is very much important. And as I said, we are very much encouraged by the coming together of the vision between Europe and Africa on the objective of the elections.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's see who else has questions. Can you put your hands up? It's all guys today. All right. Well, let's go here. Hopefully a lady. Oh, no, please. Yeah. Okay, let's have ladies first. Yeah. So you choose between you who goes first. There you go.
Hi, Nassim from the One Campaign. I just wanted to know what you think the UK will be able to participate in Cotonou post-2020.
And the lady next to you, if you want to ask a different question. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Joyce Sarpon, and it's really with regards to the private partnership that you're talking about, and I want to know what you think your role of the diaspora in being bridge builders with that. Thank you.
Great. 2 questions for you.
UK and post-Cotonou, I think that's about Brexit. Okay. We are not happy with the Brexit from a European Union perspective. UK is an important part of the EU, and we stand all to lose with the Brexit, and in particular also from my point of view, when we look at Africa, UK has been a very important partner and a key actor in the European Union's Africa policy. But decisions have been taken and the process is ongoing. When we look at post-Cotonou without the UK, it will not be the same as, let's say, the post-Cotonou with the UK. But I think our view is that we should try, and that's something that should become clear in the coming months, to ensure a UK-Africa policy that is still very much close to the European Union ones. And it's based on values, it's based on common interests, also economic interests. So there's no reason why this should not be possible. UK, for instance, has been an important partner and is we are still 28, is a very important partner for us when we do and look at our policy towards Somalia. This definitely we would like to continue. How to find ways, politically and policy-wise, how to find ways also in financial means is still to be seen, because there also DFID and UK's contribution to the European Development Fund has been extremely important. So these dimensions still have to be seen. We, some of you know, we are looking at the budgetization of European Development Fund. We certainly want to keep option open that third parties, and then we look at UK could continue contributing to the common European effort. So all this is, let's say, in process, in reflection, but the bottom line is that we want to stay very close and to partner very much, continue partnering with the UK in Africa. On the private partnerships and the role of the diaspora. The diaspora is hugely important for our migration policy, also for the political perception of Africa in many of our countries, but also indeed for the private investment and private partnership dimension. The European Union has partnered with the African Union on the remittances, African Remittances Institute, and this is an area where we will want to pursue cooperation. It is very important that we can facilitate the return of remittances, which are very important resources for many African countries, facilitate return at a lower cost, but also that we can direct, and the diaspora can direct its remittances return in a productive investment that create jobs in the way we see the continent as needed. So very much important, both for political but also for economic reasons, to work with the diaspora.
That's okay. Yeah. Wait for the microphone, please, and do tell us who you are.
I'm Richard Dowden, and I've worked on Africa for a while. Illicit financial flows, I notice you didn't mention them. This is where they take all sorts of forms, but companies can charge their overseas operations at whatever price they like. So we need more pencils. All right, we'll say $50 a pencil. This is one way the money flows out of Africa. Nana Akufo-Addo drew attention to this when he was here, and said that while Ghana produces over 66% of the world's cocoa, it only gets 6% of the money. Most of this is then ripped off or taken back into Europe and America from Ghana. It seems to add up to something like $50 billion a year. So it makes aid a little bit of a joke. What's the EU doing about this?
Shall we take one more question?
Yeah,
here's a gentleman here. We'll take questions in twos. Make sure we get...
My name is Duke Oputa, Chatham House member. In relation to governance, I just wondered what we can expect from the point of view of fighting corruption, and especially in relation to capital flight into Europe, how to control and maybe ensure that monies coming to Europe can be repatriated back into Africa.
Thank you very much.
Two related questions to a certain extent.
Partnered well.
2018 is the Africa year for the fighting of corruption, African Union year. So we are in the process of developing, we are having discussions how we can partner. And I think for both issues you raised, corruption, illegal financial flows, there's certainly openness on our side and the need to to work together, that this should be part of the partnership we are developing with Africa. Illegal financial flows, I have to admit it's a very complex issue that has been discussed, and we will continue discussing it with the African partners. It has been raised also at the Abidjan summit. It's much more difficult, though, to identify concretely what can be done. But we recognize that there is a responsibility also on the European side, and very much readiness to work on it. It is indeed, let's say, difficult to understand that there are financial flows and that ODA flows, but that, on the other hand, important flows of financing are leaving the African continent without contributing to its development. So we are ready to look into it. We are looking into it, but we still have to come to a clear conclusion with our African partners what exactly we can do at European Union level, and there is also important responsibilities at member states level, and these still need to be sorted out. On corruption, broadly speaking, as I said, the African EU year, we are discussing then what we can do. In May, the African Union Commission is coming to Brussels for the yearly meeting with the European Union Commission. It's the only, let's say, commission-to-commission meeting the European Union Commission has with an external partner, and this will certainly be on the agenda. Again, shared responsibilities on the African side, responsibilities on our side, and we have to determine clearly what each side can bring in.
Thank you. Let's get some more questions. The hands are going up. So lady right in the front here. The microphone is coming to you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Togo Elfik-Puli from Uniting to Combat Entities. You mentioned earlier on about domestic resource mobilization is something that's lagging behind, and yet we know that the SDGs will not be achieved if we do not invest, if countries themselves don't invest. So I'm wondering how the EU is going to support that particular agenda, and whether the EU continuing to be the largest funder of the African Union perpetuates that situation, because then countries themselves are not investing in institutions that are wholly run and owned by the African continent.
Okay, and I'll take another question. Let's see some hands. So there's Chris, this gentleman here.
Thank you very much, Rusaged, independent researcher. Well, I would like to really ask on the role of the civil society. Well, the role of civil society has really been, was not robust during the first part, especially this was demonstrated when we had the summit in Abidjan, where they were actually was not given a platform even to address the meeting. So what are your future plans, or to what extent are you really planning to make it more robust in the second phase? Thanks.
Thank you to both of you. Good. Yeah.
Domestic revenue mobilization is indeed a key element, as you mentioned, for each and every country to attain its LDGs. It's the overall evolution of Africa taking responsibility for its own future. We already partner with African countries in assisting them to put in place the right domestic revenue mechanisms. This is, let's say, from our development cooperation arm in Brussels. It has incentives. It also gives, let's say, the structural support to countries to put in place the right mechanism. And it is something where we see in the international statistics that Africa is improving, but as I mentioned in my introduction, where more progress will be needed, and that's why we attach so much importance to it, and that's also why it was one of the specific elements mentioned in the political declaration of the summit in Abidjan. On civil society and Abidjan, but more broadly speaking, one of what we think the positive elements of the Abidjan summit was the preparation with youth of course, this is only one part of civil society, but in the year of youth of the African Union last year, a very important one. And I think we managed for the first time to really include youth. It was not a summit about youth, it was a central theme, but it was to a great extent a summit with youth. And we included them in the preparations. There have been numerous consultations. We had what we call the plug-in initiative with thousands of applications on the African side and the European side to, let's say, participate and contribute to the summit. And the youth contribution to the summit was fully, let's say, successful in the sense that they contributed to the discussions for each and every session. There was a specific encounter with youth at the eve of the summit where many African heads of state and governments were present, so you saw that there was a real interaction. On civil society proper, there has been, we think, more for organizational matters, a restriction of their contribution to the summit, in particular the second day, because of a bit of a chaotic organization the second day. But we certainly are determined that for our future relationship, we keep, let's say, a very much multi-layered relationship. We don't talk only with governments, institutions. We also want to develop this relationship, and I think this is specific for the European Union compared to others, with civil society, with youth, and that should remain an integral part of the partnership.
Okay, some more questions. So right at the back there. There's a microphone right behind you.
Yeah, Paul Milley, Chatham House. You talked about how attitudes to governance in the future relationship might evolve and pointed out that there are quite stark differences between some regions of the continent and others. Now, we've seen over the last 20 years that the Clause 96 governance conditions in the Cotonou Agreement have been a very powerful influence in those relationships, at least with some parts of the continent. Does this mean that you're going to step back from that completely and leave African regions or Africa as a whole to manage governance principles? Or do you think you're going to end up with a sort of varied relationship so that with some parts of the continent, governance is formalized as part of the relationship as it is now, and with other parts, it isn't?
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll go to this. Oh, okay. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. You choose.
Thank you. I think following on from the sort of question on governance.
Do tell us who you are, please.
Name is Derek Sanyahombi from
Thank
British
you.
Expertise. Talking on governance, and I think following on from that question as well, I mean, Southern Africa, as you mentioned, there's a lot of developments happening, especially in South Africa and Zimbabwe. And the US Senate on Foreign Relations just recently made some demands on Zimbabwe for electoral reforms to enable what they would see as free and fair elections. What is the EU's position on that?
You can't come to London without having to be asked about Zimbabwe. You know that, Kuhn. Yeah.
I'm well prepared. Governance in the broader sense and regional approaches. I don't think we are looking at regional approaches toward governance. I think we have to keep not only let's say a continental approach, but in the European Union's external actions, values, governance will always be there, not just for Africa, but also for the other relationships we have with regions in the world. But when we look at governance, and I said that we have to find maybe a different way, we will not step back from values, from governance that remain a very important feature. And it has been a very important element of Cotonou so far, with dialogues, let's say principles and so on. So not stepping back, but finding maybe a better way to progress on these. Africa has changed. It's much more maturity, stepping up and standing up for its own and ways how to want to develop, and we have to take that into account. We have been sometimes criticized for being patronizing. That doesn't work in some countries, so we have to find other ways, balancing, as I said, still the values with the strategic interests we have. So you can't have a regional approach, but you can have, and I think we should have, tailor-made approaches while ensuring overall coherence, looking at, let's say, specific situations, and see how you can be most, let's say, helpful in furthering governance issues. And that is sometimes not easy because situations are complex: internal security, regional security, migration elements, economic dimensions. But having all these together is also a way to have a more open, more mature discussion where the governance should remain a very important part. On Zimbabwe, and I mentioned it in my introduction as one of these transitions that I think can be seen and we want to see as an opportunity. The European Union has been invited by the new president to observe the elections. And last week we had an exploratory mission on the ground to see what the conditions are and whether an observation mission would be, let's say, a positive contribution to the credibility of the elections, and whether the conditions are in place to observe the elections. And I think the fact that we are invited is already an important element when you look at the history of the relations between Zimbabwe and the European Union. So it is a commitment, and President Mnangagwa committed to credible elections. That's where we are. This mission will come back, will identify, let's say, some elements that can be or should be improved between now and the elections. But certainly, let's say, we are looking in a positive way to this invitation.
Thank you very much. You were patient, so you've got the microphone. Go ahead.
I'm Mark Langan from the University of Newcastle. You mentioned the need to support agribusiness and to support value chains. And I just wonder, to what extent is that guided by food security concerns? Because, for example, I was doing research in Ghana last summer looking at the poultry and the tomato sectors there and how they're being decimated by cheap frozen chicken from Germany, tinned tomato products from Italy. All the jobs are being lost. And obviously with the Economic Partnership Agreement, the Ghanaian government no longer has the policy space to protect these industries. So I just wondered what, going forward, what support might be made available to these sectors that are being devastated by the EPAs.
Thank you very much. And there's a gentleman just there. We'll do one more round after this. Yep, just there. Yep. There's a microphone for you. Do tell us who you are.
Okay, Tony Chafer, University of Portsmouth. I was just wanting to ask about, you talked about a more continent-wide approach under Cotonou. Of course, traditionally, the EU has had a kind of twin-track approach through the Africa-EU summits and then through the Cotonou ACP agreement. And I was wondering if you see these two kind of processes increasingly merging in future.
Okay, so those two.
Ghana, economic partnership agreements, value change. Ghana was one of the countries that advocated actively for the economic partnership agreements. And the then foreign minister, Tete, came to the European Parliament. There were very many voices against Ghana joining economic partnership agreement, but she defended the choice of her country to join because they clearly saw the interest of the country. That does not mean that there could be sectoral, let's say, need for adaptation and so on, as you mentioned, in particular on agribusiness. But that's exactly also where the economic partnership agreements provide for not only for safety nets in the negotiations, but also in the implementation. If we see that one sector would suffer specifically from implementation of the economic partnership agreements, the country has the right to, let's say, to freeze implementation and to ensure that sectors are not completely disturbed. But the economic partnership agreements also mean, and that's the partnership agreement, also give means and ways of, let's say, putting the right mechanisms in the countries in place so that they can, let's say, absorb the trade relationship under the economic partnership agreement and can grow. European Union has no interest in putting or implementing an economic partnership agreement that would not contribute to economic growth on the African continent and in the specific countries. On the continent-wide dimension, indeed there has been a twin approach with summits, what we call the Joint Africa-European Union strategy, and then the ACP dimension. And I think the impossibility, unless for an advised audience as you are, the impossibility to explain it to the outside world that we had these two dimensions is one, I think, should be one of the key elements for the European Union to bring more coherence for the European Union and for Africa, to bring more coherence in its relationship. Since post-Cotonou came in place, of course, there's the important element of the deepening integration on the African side. For the first time in Abidjan, it was an African Union, European Union summit. We never had an AU-EU summit. It was always Africa-EU because of the membership issues on the African side. So there is now, with Morocco also integrating the African Union, the whole continent is there. And both the political imperative of the proximity and the interdependence of the interests between our two continents, which is different between Africa and Europe, and Africa and Europe and the Caribbean, or the Europe and the Pacific countries. This is really something that matters. It's our neighborhood, the word I used previously. So there is a clear strategic interest to deepen that continent-to-continent relationship for the clarity, but also the political imperative, and then, let's say, our clear joint interest on security, prosperity, migration, and all the elements. In that sense, the negotiations we will have are a test for the integration on the African side. To what extent Africa is ready to engage with us as one continent. I mentioned the discussions which are ongoing with the Northern African countries, which have specific relationship with the European Union on association agreements. And we say that will remain the specificity of that relationship. The specificity of our relationship with South Africa will remain. Also the specificity of our relationship with, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa in between, which is of different relationship and development cooperation still than for the other countries. So everyone should be able to preserve what it has, but should gain the additional dimension of the continent-to-continent relationship. Because of that, we look at regional approach, because of what I mentioned, Libya and Sahel, or the Gulf and the Horn, Egypt is playing a very important role. There is a need for a continental approach, that's clear. Africa is ready. Again, they illustrated it by the Continental Free Trade Agreement a couple of weeks ago, just the economic expression of it. Africa is ready when you look at the AU and its role in security. So we are in a different context, and it's time now, in our view, to give that continent-to-continent dimension its full significance and strategic importance for the European Union.
Okay,
African Union.
We're going to do one quick round now. Okay, so I'm going to take very, very short and sharp. I want to be as comprehensive as possible in the true European style. So tell us who you are and quick question.
My name is Idris, and I write for a website called Alternative Africa. I just want to find out how frightened is EU about the continued penetration of China, and is that going to fatten into your relationship with Africa?
Thank you. And just behind, yeah, I'm going to So you're going to have a list of questions here. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Gordon Cumming, Cardiff University. Can I just clarify your point about the budgetisation that you referred to? Are you suggesting that the Cotonou is now going to be no longer on bilateral pledges in the way that European Development Fund was? Because if so, what are the implications? Does that free up aid money, basically?
Okay. The gentleman here. We'll keep on moving down this way. Sharp and succinct like the other two.
Sanit Bagri from Action for Southern Africa. Our recent experiences of working on countries like Swaziland and Zimbabwe leads us to believe that the EC, unlike the European Parliament, doesn't see promoting human rights and democracy as a major priority. And I would suggest that your framing of the interests and values needing to be balanced could be part of that problem, in the same way that you were saying that it could be patronising to simply ask countries to fulfil their international obligations. And I think that could also be part of the problem as well, with all due respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there's two more here, and then we're finishing.
Hi, Ahmed Solomon from Chatham House from the Africa Programme. How you doing? So you talked a couple of times about external influence in Africa and mentioned the Gulf countries in the Horn. I wondered whether there are ways that the EU can work together with African countries, with the AU regional blocs, the RECs, and other external actors, such as those in the Gulf, to pursue the political, economic development and governance ambitions.
And the final gentleman here.
Vincent Alila Moody's. Can you just tell me elaborate on your criteria and priorities for selecting private investment projects, and over what time period are you going to spend your 4 billion?
There you go, Kuhn.
Okay. China. Are we frightened by China, if I understood your question well? The reality of a maturing continent is that it has multiple partnerships. European Union, US, China, others. Turkey is investing heavily also on the continent. The short response is that it's up to, let's say, Africa to ensure that all these partnerships serve the interests of economic development and stability on the African continent. We, as an EU, think that we go for a fair partnership that exactly ensures that aim, that what we do contributes indeed, and that we work together with African partners for prosperity and stability. I mentioned all the different areas and sectors where we do this. China has its own approach. We see it, some countries wanting to, let's say, to follow China's model. China has and is still doing important, let's say, investments on the continent. We have a dialogue with China on Africa, where we try to join forces politically, but also, if possible, operationally. The bottom line is what is good for Africa on this. I mentioned the debt issue, which is coming back again, where it's not only China, but China plays a role in this. And it is important that we can work together and preserve, let's say, the gains and the important gains that have been done. There's a comparative advantage sometimes that China can do. We think we also have comparative advantages, in particular on, let's say, the kind of relationship and partnership we are developing with Africa. And in a shifting global environment where we see Africa policy in Washington not very with a clear direction, where we think that African countries, which maybe at one stage were hoping that all answers would be given by China, they realize now that this is not the case. And in that shifting global context, the European Union is maybe emerging as the partner, the more stable, reliable partner that has been always there. Investing also in countries when they face problems, like in the Sahel, with budget support, allowing them to survive in a very difficult environment. And these are answers other partners are not giving, and I think that's important. So I think we should also, as European Union, look from our own strengths and our own contribution to the continent. The question about aid, the Continental Approach, of course the country dimension will remain very much important, and when we look at our development cooperation, that will remain for a very important part bilateral with each and every country. Of course there will be, as we have now, a regional dimension, the economic communities, and a continental dimension. One we certainly want to increase, but let's say a very important part of the cooperation will remain country-based, and with the coherence among all these levels. There was a question on governance which I did not really understand.
This one here.
What the focus was, yes.
I think it's about that human rights and values issues. Are they being eroded? Are they being trumped by, private sector migration security issues?
No, and no erosion. I already was able to say this, but I also think we have to find another way, to a certain extent, to promote these values. We have a different kind of dialogue with African countries, not the same kind of dialogue we had 10 years ago. I think it's much more open, it's much more building on African ownership. They are putting in place their governance architecture with very important, let's say, policy documents such as the Charter for Democracy and Elections. We have to see country by country how to calibrate our approach and what works best in the given circumstances. You need to ensure overall coherence, as I said, not just in our relations with Africa, but also relationship with other continents, but then translate this for specific region, but I think in particular also for specific country situations. And what is important, for instance, when we discuss the DRC, is to ensure for different difficult, let's say, crises or challenges, is that we can build an African constituency with us to work together to improve the situation. On external influences, I indeed mentioned, because I think it is, or we think it is an important element of, let's say, the fragility and the instability on the continent because of issues of terrorism, extremism. There is an external dimension, undoubtedly, and it is important in particular because of often weak institutions and weak countries to cope with these external influences, to engage not only with these, let's say, external influences, other partners. I mentioned China, and we have, when we engage now, and Federica Mogherini, the High Representative, when she engaged with the Gulf countries, she talks about the Horn. This was not the case a couple of years ago. Now it is the case when we work and talk about Libya. It very much has the notion of Libya's southern borders, southern neighbors, and the risk and the real risk, and of course to a certain extent it is happening, of spreading instability in the wider region. But we also can, and we do work with the African Union, with countries of a specific region to strengthen resilience, to let's say, to be able to cope with these external influences. For instance, Federica Mogherini has now a specific dialogue with a group of Horn countries, which is exactly also dealing with this. How can we promote, strengthen your regional cooperation so that you can resist better external influences? And of course the dialogue should be, again, as for the previous question, how these influencers can support positively the opportunities in Africa. And the gains that have been reached over the last couple of years. On private investment and how quickly we will want to disperse or spend that money, I think we first and foremost want to spend it very, let's say, in a very thorough way and in a positive way. The focus will be very much on the issue of job creation. I think that's an important part of it. But also on, and when we look at infrastructure that connects the big connectivity areas, which will promote and support regional integration. And I think that are the two dimensions. So there's the SME, small and medium-sized enterprises dimension, and then there's the dimension of the big connectivity infrastructure works. So it needs to be spent well. If it can be spent well rapidly, that's perfect, because we will foresee for the next, let's say, multi-annual financial frameworks, instruments in the same way. So it is spending well, but spending rapidly, because the needs are there. That's clear.
That's it, Koen. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the audience here at Chatham House, but also those who've been live streamed in. I know there are still people following us because I've got it on my phone here. So, Koen, thank you. Good luck. I know you're off traveling very quickly from here. And let's stay in touch, and let's also show Koen in our customary appreciation for your time today. Thank you.